Okay, and acknowledgements to my co-author, Rob Wheeler, who I'm sure many of you know can't be with us today. First of all, I just wanted to start with a snapshot of South Australian barley production last year and for the last 15 years or so to put last season in context. Now, we've seen, I guess, a fairly stable level of area sown to barley in South Australia at around 1 million hectares or just over, and perhaps in 2010 a significant deviation from that with a fair drop below 1 million tonnes, 1 million hectares, and then last year a return to a perhaps more consistent with the long-term average area sown. And of course, as you can see from the state production in the dotted line, there's really no relationship in terms of area sown and total production. Our total production relies really on our hyper-variable seasonal conditions. Now, one of the comments I wanted to make to this is that we've heard from GRDC yesterday about a range of new systems and approaches that they're putting into place to get stronger regional feedback and regional engagement, I guess, in terms of their processes. And one of the things that I really want to sort of emphasise for you is that probably all of you in this room know how important barley is in the South Australian farming system and the scale of where it fits. So barley production in SA is typically 60 to 70% the size of wheat production. When we move around the country, we see actually that's actually unusual. And so if we look at Western Australia, the next biggest barley producing state, barley production is only about 20% the size of wheat, and similar sort of ratio in New South Wales. So in terms of GRDC getting messages about the importance of barley, the importance of investments in barley-specific research, often, certainly I've found it difficult sometimes to prioritise barley on their radar, and I guess I'm just trying to implore you to use these new regional focus tools that GRDC are employing to highlight your barley-related issues, because the other states will probably have a different perspective on the relative importance of barley. So that's a little ad for you to advocate barley research. If we look at last year, what did we learn from it? In general, it was a pretty good season for barley. If I leave pricing and marketing to one side, there was a relatively good rate of barley production achieving malting grades and F1 grades. And my thanks to Viterra for doing an analysis for this, looking at some of the key issues around downgrades with respect to malting barley in particular. So over the long term, we typically see in South Australia high screenings levels and high protein being the major causes for downgrades, and then we have particular seasons where things like sprouting or black point might come in. Last year we didn't see any one feature of downgrades, so there were sort of similar contributions from all the various reasons that your growers can get downgraded. Some high and low protein, but generally the protein mix was pretty good. Some black point, some screenings, test weight, etc. So there was no standout feature. But that was a bit of a contrast to the sorts of feedback that Rob Wheeler and I were getting from advisors and growers about the sorts of issues that they were highlighting. And certainly the two key ones were test weight in the newer malting varieties and also segregation availability. So I just wanted to make some comments on those particular things. This table shows the mean test weight from NVT trials for the main varieties that we're familiar with, and we're talking about 20 sites each year by 3 replications, and in this set of data over 5 years. So there's a lot of data points that contribute to this 5-year mean value. Now, what we know, and we've, I think, acknowledged this and extended this information on a lot of occasions, is that Schooner, the Sloop varieties and Flagship have had very good test weight, and the newer varieties, particularly Bull Oak and Commander, are lower. Now I guess the question in my mind is, are they significantly lower to the point where they're actually causing issues in terms of disproportionate frequency of downgrade, or is there something else going on? And if we look at this data set, I guess we'd say that the values for Commander are actually not very different to, well, they're better than Keel and probably quite similar to Maritime. And Maritime's had a reputation of very high and very stable test weight. So I guess I'm starting to ask the question, well, is this actually the feedback that we're getting? Is it a function of this relatively modest decrease in test weight in these newer varieties, or is there something else happening? And one of the things that focused our attention on this was both Sardi and Viterra received some samples of commercial deliveries that had been downgraded quite badly, like to F3, on the sole reason of poor test weight. And when those samples were cleaned or re-threshed, they made it into Malt 1. So those growers could have actually delivered it as Malt 1 if it was a perfectly harvested sample. And I guess we just sort of start to wonder whether, given recent seasons of the impact of rainfall at harvest, we've seen a huge lift in the emphasis of harvest speed and getting things done quickly. We're also seeing a trend to increased use of contractors, and just starting to wonder about, well, is the attention being paid to harvester settings in relation to sample quality, particularly in terms of ongoing monitoring of harvester setup as temperature changes, heats up from the morning and cools down again? Is the time being taken to actually optimise all of those things, or is it getting lost a bit in the hurly-burly of harvest? Because it seems to me that that's an opportunity to manage these slightly lower test weights in the newer varieties. Then the question is also, or suggestions being made as to whether it's useful for us to generate some sort of visual guide, because obviously you can't over-thresh them, you'll get downgraded for skinnings damage as well. But if the harvester settings are not right, you can leave a stub of the awn on the grain, and then that has a massive negative impact on the actual test weight. And so whether we come up with a visual guide just showing the amounts of stub on awn and how that relates to test weight in samples, so that people who aren't always thinking about this have got a real easy, ready reckoner. Appreciate feedback on whether that's worth the effort or not. Okay. The second point that I wanted to discuss was segregations. Now, to put this in context, and again, data courtesy of Viterra, so my thanks to them. If we look at the variety mix just 3 years ago, 2009-10, we had malting barley production dominated by the sloop varieties at about 23% of the total area sown in South Australia, and flagship and schooner making up the other dominant proportion of malting barley production. And so that variety mix obviously reflected the segregation provisions, allocation of segregation across the storage system. Doesn't really impact so much on segregations, but notably at that just 3 years ago, Keel was well and truly dominant at 20% of the total area sown. Bark already flagging down. It was, of course, previously the dominant feed barley variety, and Maritime managed to sneak up to about 12%, so quite an important variety. Now, in only 3 years, we've seen a huge shift, with Bull Oak and Commander being insignificant, up to 35% of the state's barley production, and our long-term established varieties down around 4 and 5% each. Now, I think that adoption rate, that change in the variety mix, has happened faster than perhaps the industry overall has predicted or been able to manage, and it's certainly been reflected in segregation availability and challenges around segregation. Certainly Viterra are currently in the process of a large planning review, looking at allocation of segregation, and that's an ongoing exercise, of course, through the year, but there's a particular exercise going on at the moment, including reviewing feed grade deliveries to try and establish how much Commander and Bull Oak were actually delivered as feed, because there was no convenient or close enough segregation for malting. But I guess I just really do want to emphasise again the importance of engaging your local silo committees, your local Viterra CRM, or anyone else in the value chain to keep feeding information in that can go into segregation planning to really support, I guess, particularly Commander and Bull Oak, having the best returns that they can. Okay, so I'll move on to NVT. That's a couple of messages out of production from last year. If we move on to the NVT trials, we had a fairly good and sort of early start to trial seeding, and it's, the 20 sites were all sown in fairly conventional barley seeding dates. Of course, we had a fairly unusual summer leading into last year, and it favoured carryover of high levels of leaf rust inoculum, and that translated into severe and widespread leaf rust infection observed in this trial series, but of course observed throughout commercial production across the state. It varied somewhat region by region, but certainly leaf rust was the #1 foliar disease. And of course within NVT there have been moves to improve disease management through foliar fungicide application, and unfortunately barley has been a little bit behind wheat in terms of that. So the results from last season do still reflect differences in leaf rust resistance, and so you need to take some interpretation into it when you're looking at those results. It varies site by site and region by region, but I don't think you can always take the trial results as reflecting straight yield performance in that environment. The sites themselves varied from 1.5 tonnes up to 6.3 tonnes. Generally good physical grain quality across those sites, except where extreme leaf rust pressure has affected grain size. Rob made some of the same mistakes that I did with our trial series and managed to get protein levels higher than average commercial production, so we have to review how we do that. But otherwise a fairly informative set of data. So in the paper, and I would like to commend the paper to you, a bit of effort's gone into that, and so that I know you probably don't want to sit down and read pages and pages of text, but there are some hopefully useful bits of information in there. I've summarised one of the tables that's in there just to give a snapshot of the overall yield performance on a statewide level, and here I've just restricted it to those varieties that are in commerce at the moment. I don't want to go through any of the individual numbers there, but some obvious key messages, I guess, is that the values bolded and underlined are those varieties that have performed in the top 3 for that region, and as you'd expect, the feed varieties have dominated over the malting varieties, and the most notable performer was Oxford, which has performed in the top group in all regions again, so that's now building up a picture of pretty long-term successful performance in NVT. Although notably, I think Oxford is the latest maturing of all of the varieties in this mix, and so it has had some benefit from the nature of the seasons we've had over the last 2 years, but certainly there's no doubt about its overall yield potential. Within the malting category, it's really only Commander that's challenging the feed varieties, at least out of last season, in terms of sheer yield potential on a helicopter view of performance. If we move on to the long-term analysis, so this has been updated to include last year's trial results, and Tom Giles kept me up all night last night changing these slides so it reflected the way he presented some of the NVT yesterday, but I think it does help. So what I've done is I've got current accredited malting varieties in green as the first cohort, current feed barley varieties in the grey colour, and those varieties that are currently in the accreditation pre-release space, and our sole new dedicated feed barley variety on the end. So I kind of like this format. I used to have them all alphabetical, but I agree with Tom's suggestions. So a couple of comments on this big group, and this is the lower EP, long-term performance data, and there are more varieties than this that are variously in the mix, but it is a large group of varieties that are all, most of them, really trying to compete for almost a gardener production environments across Australia. And as we heard from Viterra yesterday, there is simply no way that all of these are going to be commercially successful. So whether it's their agronomic performance, whether it's the market development, or whether it's the Barley Australia accreditation process, something is going to kill some of these varieties, and there'll only be a couple. And of course, that's really all our industry can manage in any case. So I'll leave you to go through some of the individual data, but if we scroll through some of the regions, essentially, if we move across to the mid-north, you see essentially the same sort of picture with Commander really dominating in terms of the current commercial varieties. Not a lot in it now that we add error bars between Hindmarsh, Fleet and Oxford. But this new batch of varieties really does promise to offer something more. So we hope that whatever comes out and survives out of this group will be offering growers something positive. I think Grange has been quite consistent over the last couple of years in terms of its yield potential, so it would be one I would keep an eye on. I guess I want to introduce the concept here of some left field varieties that you may not hear much about as you go along. For instance, this particular variety will not go into Barley Australia accreditation. It is a proprietary international variety that has a patented trait associated with it, and it will be going into closed loop niche production. There are also other varieties that are at a similar stage in terms of their evaluation and release that are not even in NVT, again destined for that sort of closed loop contract production. So I guess you as advisors will need to be a bit proactive in keeping your ear to the ground as to whether some of those things offer opportunities for your growers, but they're not going to come through some of the conventional systems that you're used to. Again, even if we move to the southeast, we've got a similar picture in terms of the trends and the rankings of these varieties. Some of that perhaps reflecting the last couple of seasons. We would expect the Mallee and Upper EP to have a different ranking to the southeast, but that's the run of years that we've had. One other thing that I'd like to try and introduce is a bit of a take-home message if I can. If we look just out of last year's physical grain quality data, one thing that we tend not to think about very much is 1,000 grain weight because it's not a delivery standard. And I suppose traditionally the varieties of all, barley's been barley, you sow at 70 kilos per hectare, target 120 plants per square metre, it doesn't matter whether it's schooner or sloop or whatever, it's all going to be about the same. The plasticity of barley and its plant architecture will probably compensate for small differences. But what I want to point out is that Fleet actually has much higher 1,000 grain weight than the other varieties. And of course feed barley is often used as an ancillary tool in terms of weed management, weed competition. Fleet is used in that sort of role, and just bear in mind what your actual plant densities might be if you're contrasting Fleet and Hindmarsh. They've got a 20% difference in 1,000 grain weight, which might actually be enough to influence the competitive effects. These things don't have a bearing on NVT trials, of course. All those trials are corrected for seed weight and to give constant plant numbers, but something I'll just draw to your attention that might be relevant in some cases. So with that, I think I'm on time and I'll leave it there.